Welcome to another inspirational message from Chowdean Community Church, Gateshead. For more information about Chowdean, visit www.chowdean.org.uk. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
Good morning, church. Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Now, last time I stood here and spoke to you, I asked you a question. And I said, how well do you know me? And you found out some information that I like detective stories. And it was encouraging to find that I've got some fellow detective fans in the congregation as well. Well, this morning, I want to tell you about somebody who didn't know me. Somebody who didn't know me at all. Now, in my previous life, I used to work as a customer services manager for a council. And I was actually in charge of about 150 odd staff or so. And we used to have team meetings from time to time. Well, as things often happen, a manager came in above me. I had a new manager, and she wanted to get to know the team. So she called a team meeting with all the team coaches. There was about 15 of us in the room, and there was a big conference table. And I sat next to her, and she started talking. And it was all good stuff. She was really nice, but she didn't know me. She thought because I managed a lot of people, I must be a serious manager. Well, I wasn't a serious manager at all. And what she wanted to do was to go round the table and ask everybody who was there to produce something out of either their briefcase or their handbag to introduce themselves to her so that she could get a feel for them, to look forward. And she started the ball rolling by taking out her Kindle. And she said, I always carry my Kindle with me. It has some beautiful books on it. And she talked about art and literature, all very serious, intellectual stuff. And obviously, everyone was quite impressed. And then she started going around the table, and people brought out the usual sort of things, a lipstick, a comb, and they sort of made up something about what that could possibly mean about them, because that was the aim of the story. So anyway, as it got round towards me, I could see there were a few little smirks and grins coming from the team coaches because they knew me and they knew that whatever was in my handbag was not going to be normal. Anyway, she came to me and she said, Ruth, would you like to produce something from your handbag? So I produced 3 items. I produced a packet of curry paste, I produced a small miniature pot of jam, and I produced a light bulb for a fish tank. It would be fair to say her face dropped, because it was clearly, this woman is managing my team. She didn't know me. Now, the reason she didn't know me was because she hadn't spent any time with me. She hadn't talked to me. She hadn't got to know me. And it's absolutely no different when it comes to Jesus. If we want to be close to Jesus, if we want to know Jesus, we have to spend time with him. We have to talk to him. And over the past few weeks, that's what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to come close to God, to get to know him, to know Jesus, the God that we worship. So what have we learnt? Let's just have a quick recap. We've learnt that he's the one and only Jesus. We've learnt that he was there before time began. He was outside of time. He was a miracle worker. He was the Son of God and the Son of Man, and you can't put him into any boxes. And we've also learnt that the wind and the waves know his name. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that quite interesting and also a bit challenging because some of the topics have been quite meaty and hard to understand. But it's been worth the challenge, and it's about getting to know Jesus. Well, this week we're going to look at an aspect that I think sometimes get a little bit overlooked. And it was the fact that Jesus was an extraordinary teacher. Well, whilst I was preparing this, I thought, I'm going to look up the definition of a teacher. That'll impress everybody. So I looked it up. Someone who teaches. Well, I thought that's absolutely no help whatsoever, is it? That's not going to impress anyone. So I began to think back to when I was at school. Was there a teacher that really inspired me, that was a good teacher? And I remembered Mrs. McPherson, my biology teacher. She challenged me and inspired in me a love of science. I loved biology, and we used to have many discussions about all sorts of things because she inspired me. But I've also looked up some other stories on the internet to see what a good teacher is, and I actually came across this article which I thought I'd share with you. It made me realise that a good teacher can make a really big difference in someone's life. I'll read it out to you. My woodshop teacher, Mr. Augustus J. Backman, was the most influential teacher I ever had. I had got into trouble in his class. Another student had pushed me into a wood lathe, and I became enraged and began to hit him. Mr. Backman stopped the fight, but instead of sending me to the office, he sat me down and asked a simple question. Penna, why are you wasting your life? Why aren't you going to college? Now, I didn't know anything about colleges or scholarships. No one had even considered that a fatherless boy from the poorest neighbourhood had a future. That day, instead of rushing off for lunch, he stayed and explained to me the possible education options for me. At the end of our talk, he sent me to see a secretary who had a child at a state college, and she was able to talk me through things. This was back in 1962 at Emerson High School. Well, 53 years have passed, and what have I done with the knowledge he gave me? I gained a PhD from Fordham University when I was only 29. I taught English and social studies and then moved up the chain of command from teacher to principal. I've sat on the board for Magnet Schools of America, and I've represented that organisation at the United Nations. I've won a number of prestigious education awards. But where would I be if a truly caring teacher had not taken the time out of his lunchtime to speak to me? It was without question only his confidence in me that propelled me forward. I have repaid his kindness hundreds of times by encouraging misguided youngsters to aim higher. If I have saved any children, it is because of him. If I have been a successful educator, it is because I had a great role in Mr. Backman. So, from looking at this story and others, and also my own personal experience, I've concluded the following. Good teachers. Good teachers have to care. Good teachers have to make time. Good teachers have to spark an interest and inspire their students. Good teachers have to make you want to really know more about what they are teaching. Good teachers have to make the subject understandable, and they have to use appropriate teaching methods. Good teachers have to be able to teach either one-to-one or in a group setting. But most importantly, good teachers have to challenge when they teach. Well, if Jesus was an extraordinary teacher, did he do these things? Well, what I want to do this morning is to look at 5 key aspects of Jesus as a teacher. And I want you to remember those 5 key aspects, because at the end, I'm going to challenge you in 5 areas. But before we look at them, I want to give you some background information for you to hold at the back of your mind. Now, Jesus wasn't just any teacher. He wasn't even just an extraordinary teacher. He was the teacher. In Matthew 7, verse 29, it says, "He taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." He taught as the Son of God, led by the Spirit. He had authority. It wasn't just another viewpoint. I can have a viewpoint, you can have a new viewpoint. It wasn't just another viewpoint. It wasn't open to debate. It was the truth. No discussion was needed when he taught. Jesus was so unique and different in his approach that he didn't even follow the usual practice at that time. Mostly, if you wanted to study under a rabbi, you sent in your CV and they said, yes, we'll have you, or no, we won't, type of thing. Jesus didn't do that. He actually went looking for people. He went recruiting. He sought them and he said, follow me. Now, to get back to those 5 key aspects. 1, he was ready to teach in any setting, any time, any place, anywhere. Do you remember that Martini advert, any time, any place, anywhere? It kind of put in the back of my mind, shows how old I am, sorry. But Jesus was like that. He was a teacher who taught any time, any place, anywhere. He didn't just teach in a classroom. He taught on the hillside. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. He taught in the cornfields when he was walking through on a Sunday with his disciples. He taught standing in a boat. He taught in the temple, and he taught in people's homes. He taught anytime, any place, anywhere. And he didn't miss any opportunities. He didn't miss any opportunity to teach and share the good news of the gospel. As we heard from Janice last week, he taught in the middle of a storm or whilst cooking fish by the seaside in the early morning. Any opportunity, any time. He even had time for someone when he was dying on the cross. He even had time for someone when he was dying. But not only would he teach any time, any place, he was ready to teach anyone. He didn't carry a register of students that he was prepared to teach. If your name wasn't on the list, he didn't refuse you. His mantra was, whosoever will. Anyone who wanted to follow him could, providing they wanted to learn. Well, why do I say that? How do I know this? Well, just look at the people he taught. They covered a wide range. First of all, you had the Pharisees and the scribes. Well, they were the religious know-it-alls of the time, weren't they? They were so full of themselves. They thought they knew everything, and yet Jesus was still prepared to teach them. He was prepared to teach the Roman centurions. Well, they were persona non grata to start with. They were the invaders in the time. He was still prepared to teach them. He was prepared to teach the tax collectors. Well, they weren't well liked because they used to steal all the money and used to give it to the Romans. They were despised. He taught the Samaritan woman. The Samaritans were not looked on well by the Jews at all. But he talked to her at a well. And he also talked to the woman who was about to be stoned for adultery. He taught anyone. No one was beyond his notice, and he was prepared to talk and teach to each of them. Third things, he made things easy to understand. Well, did he? He made things easy to understand, providing that you had a heart open to what he was saying. And he often taught in parables. Now, if I remember learning my GCSE RE, a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Just out of interest, how many parables can you guys remember? Can you shout some out to me? Some of the parables. Sorry? The lost son, yes. Sorry? Yes, the lost coin. Any more? The sower. Exactly. The Good Shepherd is a very well-known one, and also the prodigal son. Each of the parables had a meaning and illustrated the point that Jesus was trying to make. The prodigal son, for example, focused on how a man had taken all his inheritance, gone off, squandered the lot, got himself into deep, deep bother, came back to find his father waiting with open arms. It focused on how anyone can come back to God no matter how far they had run from him in the first place. And he will welcome them back with open arms. You know, he even introduced a little bit of humour sometimes into his parables when he talked about it was easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than it was for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it was for a rich man to go to heaven. Now, there's a couple of explanations as to that. Sometimes people have said it's actually a proper eye of a needle and a camel going through it. And other people have said it was actually a little gate in the Jerusalem wall. I don't really think it makes any difference. He was trying to bring in a little bit of humour and prove a point at the same time. The thing is with the parables, he was always trying to show the story, but it mattered whether you wanted to learn or not. You had to have that willingness to want to learn. Jesus actually gave a warning. In Matthew 13, verse 13, he says this, "Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." The reason for this? For this people's ear has become calloused. That means hardened. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts. What does that mean? People listened to the story and heard only the story because they didn't want to hear more than that. But the parables were there for people who wanted to learn, who wanted to understand. And Jesus put it in a way that they could. The fourth thing, Jesus never watered down what he said. He didn't fudge issues. He laid his cards on the table and he said things as they were. Well, why do I say this? He often had to tackle quite thorny issues like heaven and hell. And he explained, in this case, that there was a reality that on death, we permanently go to one destination or the other. He talked about there being a great gulf fixed when he told the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. It was a difficult subject, but he didn't fudge it. He said it as it was. Why? He laid it on the line, but I'm convinced that when telling this story, he wouldn't have been shouting, he wouldn't have been harsh or angry, but he would rather have been pleading in love with tears in his eyes for people to listen to him, to understand the severity of what he was saying. He would have wanted them to understand the grave and solemn importance of what he was teaching them. He had compassion, and he had love for his students, but he told them as it was. Now, the fifth aspect of Jesus as an extraordinary teacher was what he actually taught. It was extraordinary and it was truly unconventional. Now, you've got to remember that the Jewish people and all those connected with them, including the Romans, were used to living in a very legalistic time. What do I mean by that? You had to do this, you had to do this, and if you didn't, and you didn't follow the law to the nth degree, you couldn't please God. So Jesus came at a time when things were really hard. If you moved your chair on the Sabbath and there was a bit of dust on the ground and you moved it and it left a mark, the scribes and the Pharisees would turn around and say, "You're ploughing." You couldn't breathe. And Jesus came in at that time, and what he taught was different. It was revolutionary, and it still is. So what was so different about his teaching? Well, have a little look, when you have chance, at the Sermon on the Mount. It's in the first few chapters of Matthew. In the Sermon on the Mount, he covered many topics, far more than we can even look at this morning. But just to list a few of the most extraordinary topics. One, he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." 2, we shouldn't seek revenge. We shouldn't be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We should love our enemies. Our treasures are in heaven and not on this earth. We should not be judging others when we are so far from perfect ourselves. What an amazingly different and revolutionary message. So, those are the 5 aspects of Jesus' character as an extraordinary teacher. He taught anywhere, anytime. He taught anyone. He made it easy to understand, providing you wanted to. He kept it real, and he didn't fudge things. And he taught a new message, looking at things in a very different way. Okay, that's very interesting, isn't it? What difference does that make to you and to me? What difference is learning these 5 facts going to make to you as you leave here this morning? Are you going to finish here, go and have the Kilimanjaro coffee, say, well, that was interesting, and then carry on with your lives just as if I hadn't have stood here and said a word to you? Are you going to have a coffee and go and think, yeah, that was nice? Well, I want to read something to you. It should appear on the screen behind me. It's from John 13, verse 12. Now, this little passage comes after the story when Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And he's washed them each in turn. And then after that's happened, the Bible records this. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Now, the key verse here is verse 15, where it says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. So what examples do we have in learning about Jesus as a teacher? Well, actually, I think we've got a few challenges here. 1, Jesus taught anytime, any place, anywhere. Are you ready to talk about the gospel in any situation? Are you ready to talk about it at work? Are you ready to talk about it at home? In the shops if you bump into someone? On the fell on a Friday night with the Mighty Oaks cart? When it's difficult, when it's hard and when it's difficult. I know it can be sometimes even embarrassing, but are you prepared to talk about the gospel? It says in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, always, not just sometimes, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But it should always be done in gentleness and with respect and love, just as Jesus would have done. Jesus was ready to teach anyone. Are we? Do we naturally shy away from certain types of people? Do we have preconceived ideas about people? Somebody said that they shouldn't go and talk to anybody on the fell on a Friday night because they might get stabbed. Do we shy away from people that perhaps are a bit smelly or not clean? They might be poor, they might be annoying, they might be frustrating, they might be downright difficult. Are we prejudiced? Jesus talked to those who were considered beneath the notice of many people. Would you teach? Would you talk to anyone? Do we overcomplicate Jesus' message when we're talking to others? Do we dress it up in fine language and lots of theological arguments? The gospel is so simple. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. But we must be careful not to water things down and fudge issues. Sometimes we have to be prepared to say it as it is, just like Jesus did. I know that it's not always easy to say the unpopular thing, even though it's spelled out plainly in the Bible. Things like talking about heaven and hell, sin and living a holy life. I mean, tomorrow there's lots of Christians who feel that they can't celebrate Halloween, and they have to explain it to their children or their friends and their relatives why they don't celebrate it. It might be difficult. Where I'm going to work tomorrow, I think it's going to be difficult because I don't want to join in those celebrations. But again, it has to be done in a loving and not a holier-than-thou way. But I think the biggest challenge for us is when we look at what Christ taught as an extraordinary teacher. Are we peacemakers? Do we stir up things or fuel an argument just to justify ourselves? If we see an argument developing, do we try with all our heart to try and disperse it? Or we just keep niggling along and just fuel it for a bit longer? Do we like just that little bit of revenge? After all, it's only fair. The things that have happened to me, why shouldn't I see some justice? Do we really love our enemies? Sometimes I've heard it said, I love you, but sometimes I really don't like you. This goes a whole lot further than that. Love your enemies. Corrie ten Boom, who was imprisoned in Auschwitz, came face to face with a German prison guard. Could you or I have responded like she did and forgive? Do we pray for blessings on those that make our life difficult? I can't say that I always have. Do we value all this world has to offer more than the real treasure we can have in heaven? I've started watching The Apprentice, that's on television, and one of the candidates said, what I've always really, really wanted is lots of power and lots of money. Isn't that sad? But do we have things that matter to us so very much more? Do we hoard things up? Do we save things? Do we hang on to things that mean things more than what our treasure is in heaven? And finally, do we judge others? Which one of us could sit here today and say that we haven't looked at others in the past and pass judgment on them? How dare we when there is so much wrong in our own lives? So, as you leave here this morning, what difference is learning about Jesus, being an extraordinary teacher, going to make to you this week? Are you going to be challenged to think differently? Are you challenged to act differently? Are you challenged to put into action some of his examples? Let me ask you, will you witness any time, any place, anywhere? Will you be ready to tell anyone about Jesus? Will you tell people the truth of the gospel in its simplicity, but without dodging the truth? Will you try live out his revolutionary teachings so that people see him in you? So as I ask the band to come back up, I want to share a verse that came very much onto my heart as I was preparing this, and it says, "Be wise in the way you act. Make the most of every opportunity." Be wise in the way you act. Make the most of every opportunity. Shall we just close in prayer? Dear Lord Jesus, thank you that you were and are an extraordinary teacher. Thank you for showing us how we should live. I pray, Lord, that as we leave here today, each one of us could be challenged, not just to go, have a cup of coffee and forget all about what's been said, but actually challenged to make a real difference in our lives this week. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
This is the end of this message. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to find out more about our church, please visit www.chowdean.org.uk. And please take a minute to rate our podcast on iTunes.